The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Clarence's house as Charles stood by the grand window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. At 75, the king carried the weight of decades on his shoulders, each line on his face telling stories of duty, sacrifice, and difficult choices. Today felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that made his chest tighten with anticipation and dread. Kate entered the room with her characteristic grace, her presence immediately softening the formal atmosphere. She had grown into her role as Princess of Wales with remarkable poise, but Charles could see the concern etched in her features. Her usually bright eyes held a shadow of worry that had become increasingly familiar over the past months. "Your Majesty," she said softly, approaching with measured steps. The formal address felt strange between them, given their years of close relationship, but recent tensions had created an invisible barrier that both acknowledged but neither discussed openly. Charles turned from the window, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Kate, my dear, thank you for coming." He gestured toward the sitting area where two chairs faced each other, separated by a small table bearing a silver tea service that neither would touch. As they settled into their seats, Charles noticed how Kate's hands rested carefully in her lap, her wedding ring catching the morning light. She had always been thoughtful in her gestures, never one for unnecessary drama or theatrical displays. Yet today, something in her posture suggested she was bracing herself for an important conversation. "I wanted to speak with you about the upcoming state dinner," Charles began, though they both knew this was merely the opening move in a much larger discussion. The French president's visit had been planned for months, but recent developments within the royal household had complicated even the most routine events. Kate nodded, her professional demeanor intact. "Of course, William, and I have reviewed the guest list and protocol requirements." She paused, her fingers unconsciously fidgeting with her bracelet. "Though I understand there may be some changes to the arrangements." The elephant in the room hung between them like a heavy curtain. Camilla's influence on royal decisions had grown stronger in recent months, and her opinions on family matters had begun to shape palace policy in ways that concerned both Kate and William. The Queen Consort's voice had become increasingly dominant in family discussions, often overshadowing the perspectives of other senior royals. Charles cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "There have been some suggestions about protocol modifications," he admitted carefully. "Camilla believes that certain traditions might benefit from modernization." Kate's eyebrows raised slightly, a subtle indication of her surprise. She had always respected tradition while embracing necessary change, but recent proposals had struck her as more personal than practical. "I see. May I ask which traditions specifically?" The king shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This conversation was proving even more difficult than he had anticipated. Camilla had been quite clear about her expectations, and her reasoning had seemed logical when presented in the privacy of their bedroom. However, facing Kate now, Charles found himself questioning decisions that had seemed straightforward just hours earlier. "Well," he began hesitantly, "there's been discussion about seating arrangements, precedents in certain ceremonies, and the role of various family members in public engagements." Each word felt carefully measured, as if he were walking through a minefield of family dynamics and protocol requirements. Kate remained silent for a moment, processing the implications. She understood royal protocol better than most, having studied it intensively since her engagement to William. What Charles was describing sounded less like modernization and more like a systematic restructuring that would diminish the Wales family's role in favor of Camilla's preferences. "I appreciate the desire for efficiency," Kate said diplomatically, "but I wonder if we might consider the public's expectations as well. They've grown accustomed to certain arrangements, and sudden changes might create confusion." Charles nodded, grateful for her diplomatic approach. Kate had always possessed a remarkable ability to address sensitive topics without creating conflict, a skill that had served the monarchy well during various crises. Yet he could see the concern in her eyes, the same worry that kept him awake at night when he considered the long-term implications of recent decisions. "You raise valid points," he acknowledged. "However, Camilla feels quite strongly that the current arrangements don't reflect the reality of our modern monarchy." As he spoke Camilla's name, Charles noticed Kate's almost imperceptible stiffening, a reaction so subtle that only someone who knew her well would have detected it. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Outside, London continued its bustling pace, oblivious to the delicate negotiations taking place within the palace walls. Charles found himself thinking about his mother, wondering what Elizabeth II would have done in this situation. The late queen had possessed an uncanny ability to balance competing interests while maintaining family harmony, a skill that seemed increasingly elusive in current circumstances. Kate finally spoke, her voice steady but with an underlying firmness that Charles recognized from her most determined moments. Your Majesty, if I may speak frankly, the current arrangements have worked well for the public and the institution. William and I have worked hard to build relationships with various charitable organizations and international partners based on our current roles. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Any significant changes would require extensive consultation and preparation. We want to ensure that the monarchy's reputation remains strong and that public confidence isn't undermined by internal reorganization. Charles appreciated her directness, even as it complicated his position. Kate was absolutely right about the potential public relations implications, but Camilla had made equally compelling arguments about establishing clear hierarchies and avoiding confusion about royal roles. The competing pressures made his head ache with the complexity of modern royal life. I understand your concerns, he said slowly, and I want you to know that any changes would be implemented gradually and with full consideration for all parties involved. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, a diplomatic non-answer that satisfied no one. Kate leaned forward slightly, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal her genuine emotion. Charles, she said, using his first name for the first time in their conversation, this family has been through so much together. We've supported each other through difficult times and celebrated wonderful moments. I hope we can continue to work together constructively. The personal appeal struck Charles deeply. Kate was right about their shared history, the years of building trust and mutual respect. Her support during his accession to the throne had been invaluable, and William's steadfast loyalty had provided crucial stability during the transition period. Yet Camilla's concerns about establishing clear authority within the family structure also carried weight. Of course, my dear, Charles replied, reaching across the space between them. For a moment, it seemed he might take her hand in a gesture of reassurance and family unity. Kate's hand moved slightly forward, responding to the implicit invitation for connection and understanding. But, just as their hands might have touched, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Both Charles and Kate recognized the distinctive sound of Camilla's heels on marble, a rhythm that had become familiar to everyone in the household. The queen consort's approach changed the atmosphere in the room immediately, introducing a tension that hadn't existed moments before. Charles's hand hesitated in the air between them, uncertainty flickering across his features. The simple gesture of reaching out to Kate had suddenly become complicated by the approaching presence of his wife, whose opinions on family dynamics had become increasingly influential in palace decision-making. Kate noticed the hesitation and slowly withdrew her hand, understanding the delicate position Charles found himself in. The moment of potential connection dissolved as reality reasserted itself, reminding both of them about the complex web of relationships and loyalties that defined their current situation. The footsteps grew closer, and both Charles and Kate straightened in their chairs, unconsciously preparing for the shift in dynamics that Camilla's arrival would inevitably bring. What had begun as a private conversation between a king and his daughter-in-law was about to become something entirely different. As the door handle turned, Charles found himself wishing for simpler times when family relationships weren't so complicated by questions of protocol, authority, and competing visions for the monarchy's future. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than in this moment of suspended possibility, when a simple gesture of familial affection had become a political statement with far-reaching implications. The door opened, and everything changed. Camilla entered the room with the confidence that comes from years of navigating palace politics and establishing one's place within the royal hierarchy. At 76, the queen consort had developed a keen understanding of timing, presence, and the subtle art of influence that defined life within the monarchy. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her navy blue dress spoke of understated elegance that had become her signature style. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the crisp articulation that years of public speaking had refined. Her eyes quickly assessed the scene before her, taking in the positioning of Charles and Kate, the untouched tea service, and the slight tension that seemed to hover in the air like morning mist. Charles immediately stood, a gesture of respect that had become automatic over their years of marriage. Kate followed suit, her movements graceful despite the sudden shift in the room's dynamics. The conversation they had been having felt suspended, placed on hold by the arrival of someone whose opinions carried considerable weight in family decisions. "Camilla, darling," Charles said, moving toward his wife with a smile that seemed genuine yet slightly strained. "Kate and I were discussing arrangements for the upcoming state dinner." The explanation felt necessary, though all three of them understood that their conversation had encompassed much more than simple event planning. Camilla nodded, accepting the brief kiss Charles offered before turning her attention to Kate. The two women had maintained a cordial relationship over the years, built on mutual respect and shared dedication to royal duties. However, recent months had introduced subtle tensions as Camilla's role within the family structure had evolved and expanded. "Catherine," Camilla acknowledged with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The use of Kate's formal name instead of the more familiar nickname felt deliberate, a small but significant marker of the changing dynamics within the family. "I hope you're well." "Very well, thank you," Kate replied, her own smile carefully neutral. She had learned to navigate these interactions with diplomatic precision, never revealing more than necessary while maintaining appropriate courtesy. The years of royal training had served her well in situations where every word and gesture carried potential significance. Camilla moved to the window where Charles had been standing earlier, her presence immediately commanding attention. She gazed out at the gardens for a moment before turning back to the room, her expression thoughtful yet determined. "I actually wanted to speak with you both about some important matters concerning the family's public role." The statement hung in the air with obvious weight. Charles and Kate exchanged a glance, both recognizing that whatever Camilla had to say would likely shape the direction of their earlier conversation. The queen consort rarely spoke without purpose, and her tone suggested that this was not a casual social call. "Please, sit down," Charles said, gesturing for all three of them to arrange themselves in the seating area. The dynamics of their positioning suddenly became significant, with Camilla choosing the chair that commanded the best view of both Charles and Kate, while placing herself slightly apart from their earlier intimate arrangement. As they settled, Camilla folded her hands in her lap with practiced composure. "I've been giving considerable thought to our family's representation at upcoming events," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "There are certain adjustments that I believe would better serve the monarchy's interests and public perception." Kate felt a familiar tightening in her stomach. These adjustments had been a recurring theme in recent family discussions, usually resulting in modifications that seemed to diminish the Wales family's prominence, while enhancing Camilla's own position within the royal hierarchy. "What specific adjustments did you have in mind?" Kate asked, her tone carefully measured. She had learned that direct questions often revealed more than diplomatic dancing around sensitive subjects, though she remained prepared for whatever response might come. Camilla's eyes sharpened slightly, recognizing the directness in Kate's approach. "Well, for instance, the upcoming state dinner seating arrangements. I think it would be more appropriate if the Wales family were positioned according to the current hierarchy rather than historical precedent." The suggestion carried obvious implications. Current hierarchy, as Camilla defined it, placed her as queen consort in a position of authority over William and Kate, despite William's position as heir to the throne. This interpretation of royal protocol had been a source of ongoing discussion within the family, with different members holding varying opinions on proper precedents. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair, caught between his wife's strong opinions and his awareness of Kate's equally valid perspective. The complexity of royal protocol had never been more challenging than when it intersected with family relationships and personal dynamics. "The traditional arrangements have worked well in the past," Kate observed carefully. "They provide clear guidance for protocol staff and help maintain consistency in public representation." Her words were diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear. Changing established procedures without compelling reason could create confusion and controversy. Camilla's response came without hesitation. "Tradition serves its purpose, but we must also consider the reality of current roles and responsibilities. As queen consort, I have certain duties and positions that should be reflected in our public appearances." The conversation had reached the heart of the ongoing tension. Camilla's interpretation of her role had expanded significantly since Charles's accession, and she had become increasingly vocal about ensuring that her position received appropriate recognition and deference from other family members. Charles found himself in the uncomfortable position of mediating between two strong women whose perspectives reflected different visions of royal family dynamics. His mother had managed these situations with remarkable skill, but Charles was discovering that family leadership required diplomatic abilities he was still developing. Both perspectives have merit, he said carefully, attempting to find middle ground. Perhaps we could review the specific details and find arrangements that honor tradition while reflecting current realities. The response satisfied no one, but it bought time for further consideration. Kate recognized the diplomatic non-answer for what it was, but she also understood Charles's difficult position. However, she felt compelled to address the broader implications of what was being proposed. I think we should also consider public expectations and media interpretation, she said. Sudden changes in established protocols often generate speculation and commentary that can be distracting from our actual work. Camilla's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She had anticipated this argument and had prepared her response. The media will comment regardless of what we do, she said with a slight edge to her voice. Our responsibility is to the institution, not to media speculation. Clear hierarchies and proper protocols serve the monarchy's long-term interests. The room fell silent for a moment as the implications of the exchange settled. Kate understood that this conversation represented something larger than seating arrangements or protocol details. This was about establishing authority, defining relationships, and determining the future direction of family dynamics within the monarchy. Charles looked between his wife and daughter-in-law, both formidable women who had contributed significantly to the royal family's success in their own ways. Camilla's support during his transition to king had been invaluable, providing stability and perspective during challenging times. Kate's dedication to royal duties and her positive public image had strengthened the monarchy's reputation and secured public affection for the Wales family. I appreciate both of your perspectives, Charles said finally. These are important considerations that deserve careful thought and discussion. He paused, glancing toward Kate with an expression that seemed to seek understanding. Perhaps we could continue this conversation after I've had time to review all the relevant factors. Kate nodded, recognizing the request for patience even as she felt concern about the direction these discussions seemed to be heading. Of course, Your Majesty. I'm always available for further consultation on these matters. As she prepared to leave, Kate stood and smoothed her skirt, a gesture that had become automatic over years of royal engagements. The meeting had concluded without resolution, but the positions of all parties had been clearly established. The next steps would determine how these competing visions would be reconciled. Charles also stood, moved by an impulse to offer some gesture of reassurance to Kate. Their relationship had been built on mutual respect and affection, qualities that seemed increasingly important to preserve amid growing family tensions. He reached out toward her, his intention to clasp her hand in a gesture of family unity and ongoing support. Kate responded to the gesture, understanding its significance as both personal and political. In that moment, a simple touch would represent continuity, family bonds, and mutual respect that transcended protocol disputes and power dynamics. But, as their hands moved toward each other, Camilla's voice cut through the moment with startling clarity. "Charles," she said sharply, her tone carrying unmistakable authority. The single word contained volumes of meaning, conveying disapproval, territorial assertion, and a clear directive about appropriate behavior. The command stopped Charles's movement instantly. His hand froze in the space between himself and Kate, caught between impulse and obligation, family feeling and marital loyalty. The gesture that had seemed natural and appropriate seconds before suddenly became complicated by the weight of competing expectations and relationships. Kate's hand also stopped, understanding immediately what had occurred. The moment of connection had been interrupted, redirected, and ultimately denied by Camilla's intervention. The implications extended far beyond the simple gesture itself, representing a fundamental shift in family dynamics and power relationships. Charles stood frozen, his hands suspended in uncertainty, while Kate waited to see how he would respond to his wife's clear directive. The next few seconds would reveal much about current family hierarchies and the direction of future relationships within the royal household. The silence stretched uncomfortably as all three participants processed what had just occurred and what it meant for their ongoing relationships and family dynamics. The tension in the room became palpable as Charles's hand remained suspended in the air, caught between his natural impulse to reach out to Kate and his wife's clear disapproval. Time seemed frozen in that moment, with each second stretching into an eternity of uncomfortable silence. The king's face reflected the internal struggle between family affection and marital obligation, his weathered features showing the strain of divided loyalties. Kate stood perfectly still, her training in royal protocol serving her well as she maintained her composure despite the awkward situation unfolding before her. She could see the conflict playing out in Charles's expression, the way his eyes darted between her and Camilla, seeking some path through the minefield of family politics that had suddenly emerged from what should have been a simple gesture of familial warmth. Camilla remained seated, but her posture had shifted to one of unmistakable authority. Her back was straight, her chin raised slightly, and her eyes fixed on her husband with an intensity that brooked no argument. Years of navigating royal circles had taught her the importance of establishing clear boundaries, and this moment represented a crucial test of influence and hierarchy within the family structure. "I think," Camilla continued, her voice carrying the weight of deliberate authority, "that we should maintain appropriate formality in our interactions, particularly given the sensitive nature of current discussions about family roles and responsibilities." Each word was carefully chosen, designed to frame her intervention not as personal preference, but as institutional necessity. Charles's hand slowly lowered to his side, the gesture incomplete and abandoned. The defeat was visible in his shoulders as they sagged slightly, and Kate felt a pang of sympathy for the difficult position he found himself in. Being king meant balancing countless competing demands, but family relationships added layers of complexity that no constitutional training could have prepared him for. "Of course," Charles said quietly, his voice lacking its usual warmth. The words carried resignation, acknowledgement that this particular battle was not worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. He had learned over decades of royal life that sometimes retreat was the wiser course, even when it felt like betrayal. Kate nodded with professional grace, though her eyes revealed a flash of disappointment that was quickly suppressed. "I understand completely," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional undercurrent. She had become expert at hiding her true feelings behind the mask of royal propriety, a skill that served her well in moments like these. The interrupted gesture hung between them like a bridge that had been blown up before anyone could cross it. What should have been a simple moment of family connection had become a demonstration of power dynamics and competing loyalties that none of them could ignore. The implications extended far beyond the moment itself, representing a fundamental shift in how family relationships would be conducted going forward. Camilla rose from her chair with satisfaction evident in her movements, having established her point clearly and effectively. "I'm glad we're all in agreement about maintaining proper protocols," she said, smoothing her skirt as she prepared to take control of the remainder of the conversation. Her victory had been swift and decisive, leaving no doubt about her expectations for future interactions. "Now then," she continued, moving to stand beside Charles in a gesture that clearly established their united front, "I believe we have several other matters to discuss regarding upcoming royal engagements." The transition was smooth and deliberate, designed to move past the uncomfortable moment while reinforcing the new dynamic that had been established. Kate recognized that her role in the conversation had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a discussion between Charles and herself had become something entirely different, with Camilla now clearly in charge of the proceedings. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, and it represented a pattern that had been developing over recent months. "Certainly," Kate replied, though her voice carried a slight coolness that hadn't been present earlier. She remained committed to maintaining family harmony, but the events of the past few minutes had clarified certain realities about current power structures within the royal household. These realizations would influence her approach to future interactions and decisions. Camilla consulted a small notebook that she had retrieved from her handbag, the action suggesting that this meeting had been planned with greater precision than initially apparent. "The Commonwealth Day service requires coordination between several family members," she began, referring to one of the monarchy's most important annual events. "I've prepared some suggestions for role assignments that reflect current family hierarchies." The phrase, "current family hierarchies," carried obvious weight, particularly given what had just transpired. Kate understood that these suggestions would likely mirror the same themes that had emerged in their discussion about the state dinner, with Camilla's position receiving enhanced prominence while other family members found their roles adjusted accordingly. Charles nodded along with his wife's presentation, though his enthusiasm seemed forced after the emotional complexity of the previous moments. The king was clearly struggling to balance his personal relationships with institutional demands, a challenge that had become increasingly difficult as family dynamics evolved and shifted. What specific adjustments are you proposing? Kate asked, maintaining her diplomatic tone despite growing concerns about the direction these changes seemed to be heading. She had learned that details mattered enormously in royal protocol, and seemingly minor adjustments could have significant implications for public perception and family relationships. Camilla's smile was polite but determined as she outlined her vision for the service. I believe the procession order should reflect constitutional realities rather than traditional arrangements. As queen consort, my position in the ceremony should be clearly established, with other family members positioned accordingly. The proposal represented exactly what Kate had feared. Traditional arrangements for Commonwealth Day had been carefully developed over decades to balance constitutional requirements with family relationships and public expectations. Camilla's suggested changes would alter this balance significantly, prioritizing her role while potentially diminishing the prominence of other senior royals. The traditional arrangements have served the Commonwealth relationship very well, Kate observed carefully. They reflect the historical development of these important partnerships and provide continuity that many member nations value highly. Her response was diplomatically phrased, but it clearly represented opposition to the proposed changes. Charles found himself once again caught between competing perspectives, both of which carried merit from different viewpoints. Camilla's focus on constitutional hierarchy made logical sense from an institutional standpoint, while Kate's emphasis on tradition and Commonwealth relationships reflected important diplomatic considerations that couldn't be ignored. We want to ensure that all aspects of the service reflect the monarchy's current structure, Camilla replied firmly. Consistency in our public presentation strengthens the institution and provides clear guidance for future events. Her arguments were well prepared and logically presented, making them difficult to counter directly. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with various aspects of upcoming events being dissected and analyzed. Throughout the conversation, Kate maintained her professional demeanor while carefully advocating for positions that would preserve the Wales family's role and responsibilities within the broader royal framework. As the meeting progressed, it became increasingly clear that fundamental disagreements existed about the direction of royal family dynamics. Camilla's vision emphasized clear hierarchical structures with her position firmly established at the apex of family authority below Charles himself. Kate's perspective focused on collaborative approaches that balanced constitutional requirements with family relationships and public expectations. Charles attempted to moderate between these viewpoints, but his efforts were hampered by the earlier demonstration of where his ultimate loyalties lay. The interrupted gesture had revealed the reality of current power dynamics within the family, making it difficult for him to serve as an effective mediator between competing visions. When the formal discussion finally concluded, Kate prepared to leave with the understanding that many important decisions remained unresolved. The competing perspectives had been clearly articulated, but finding acceptable compromises would require additional conversations and careful consideration of various factors. Thank you for your time today, Kate said formally, addressing both Charles and Camilla with equal courtesy despite the emotional complexity of recent interactions. Her professionalism remained intact, though the warmth that had characterized her relationship with Charles seemed diminished by recent events. Charles stood to accompany her to the door, a gesture of courtesy that seemed automatic despite the tensions that had emerged during their discussion. As they walked the few steps across the room, he appeared to wrestle with something he wanted to say, some acknowledgement of what had transpired and its implications for their relationship. Kate, he began quietly, his voice carrying a note of regret that surprised both of them. For a moment, it seemed he might apologize or offer some explanation for his actions, some recognition of the difficult position they had all found themselves in. But, before he could continue, Camilla's voice once again cut through the moment. "Charles, we have the Prime Minister's briefing in 15 minutes, she reminded him, her tone suggesting that personal conversations were less important than official duties. The interruption was perfectly timed and completely appropriate, yet it served to prevent any private moment between Charles and Kate. The king's shoulders sagged slightly as he acknowledged his wife's reminder. "Of course," he said, the moment of potential connection once again lost to the demands of duty and schedule. Whatever he had intended to say would remain unsaid, at least for now. Kate nodded with understanding, though disappointment flickered across her features before being quickly suppressed. "I'll see myself out," she said, sparing Charles the awkwardness of choosing between accompanying her and attending to his wife's schedule requirements. As she reached for the door handle, Kate paused for just a moment, looking back at Charles with an expression that conveyed both affection and concern. The gesture was subtle but meaningful, a reminder of the relationship they had built over years of shared experiences and mutual respect. Charles met her gaze briefly, and, in that moment, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The easy warmth and family connection that had characterized their interactions for years would now be complicated by new realities and competing loyalties that neither of them had fully anticipated. The door closed softly behind Kate, leaving Charles and Camilla alone in the room that had witnessed such a complex interplay of family dynamics, institutional requirements, and personal relationships. The silence that followed carried the weight of all that had been said and, perhaps more importantly, all that had been left unsaid. As the door closed behind Kate, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The formal tension that had characterized the three-way conversation gave way to something more intimate, yet potentially more volatile. Charles and Camilla were alone together, surrounded by the echoes of what had just transpired and the weight of decisions that would shape their family's future. Camilla moved to the window, her back to Charles as she gazed out at the gardens where tourists and photographers often gathered, hoping to catch glimpses of royal life. The irony was not lost on her that the most important moments of royal existence often occurred far from public view, in private rooms where family members negotiated the complex relationships that defined their public roles. "That went well, I think," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction mixed with something harder to define. Victory, perhaps, or relief that important boundaries had been established without more dramatic confrontation. The Queen Consort had learned over years of royal life that small victories in private often prevented larger conflicts in public. Charles remained standing near where Kate had left him, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that conveyed uncertainty despite his attempt at formal composure. The interrupted gesture still haunted him, representing not just a moment of connection denied, but a fundamental shift in how he would need to navigate family relationships going forward. "I'm not certain it went as well as it could have," Charles replied carefully, his voice carrying undertones of regret and confusion. The king was discovering that balancing the competing demands of marriage and family relationships required diplomatic skills he hadn't fully developed, even after decades of royal training and experience. Camilla turned from the window, her expression patient but firm. She had anticipated this conversation and had prepared her arguments carefully. "Charles, darling, you must understand that clarity in family relationships serves everyone's interests, including Catherine's. Ambiguous hierarchies create confusion and undermine institutional authority." The explanation was logical and well-reasoned, reflecting Camilla's sophisticated understanding of royal politics and organizational dynamics. She genuinely believed that establishing clear authority structures would benefit the monarchy in the long term, even if it required uncomfortable adjustments in the short term. Charles nodded slowly, though his agreement seemed reluctant. "I understand your reasoning," he said, "but I'm concerned about the impact on family relationships. Kate has been enormously supportive, and I worry that these changes might damage important partnerships within the family." The concern was valid and reflected Charles's awareness that modern monarchy depended heavily on collaborative relationships between senior family members. The Wales family's popularity and effectiveness had contributed significantly to the institution's success, and any actions that undermined those relationships could have broader implications. "Family relationships will adjust to new realities," Camilla replied with confidence. "Catherine is intelligent and professional. She'll understand that institutional requirements must take precedence over personal preferences. These adjustments will ultimately strengthen the monarchy by providing clear guidance for decision-making and protocol." Her analysis was coldly logical, treating family dynamics as organizational problems to be solved rather than emotional relationships to be nurtured. This approach had served Camilla well in establishing her own position within the royal framework, but Charles wondered if it might be too simplistic for the complex web of relationships that defined their current situation. As they talked, Charles found himself thinking about his sons and their reactions to these developing changes. William had become increasingly concerned about his family's position within the royal hierarchy, not out of personal ambition, but from genuine worry about their ability to serve effectively. Harry's departure from royal duties had been painful enough. Charles dreaded the possibility of further family fractures. What about William? Charles asked, voicing his concerns about his heir's potential reaction to the changes being implemented. He's been remarkably supportive during my transition to king, and I'm worried that these adjustments might create unnecessary tension with the next generation. Camilla had anticipated this question as well. William will adapt because he understands institutional necessity, she said with conviction. As heir to the throne, he benefits from clear hierarchical structures that define roles and responsibilities. These changes actually support his future position by establishing precedents for authority and decision-making. The argument was clever and contained enough truth to be compelling. William would indeed benefit from clear constitutional frameworks, and established precedents for royal authority could serve him well when he eventually became king. However, Charles suspected that his son might not view current changes as supportive of his interests. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the palace, Kate was making her way through familiar corridors that suddenly felt different. The conversation she had just left had clarified certain realities about her position within the family that she had suspected but hoped to avoid confronting directly. The interrupted gesture had been symbolic of larger changes that would affect not just her but William and their children as well. As she walked, Kate reflected on the evolution of her relationship with Charles over the years since her marriage to William. The king had been welcoming and supportive, treating her as a beloved daughter-in-law whose contributions to royal life were valued and appreciated. That warmth had been evident even at the beginning of their meeting today, but the dynamics had shifted dramatically with Camilla's arrival and intervention. The implications extended beyond personal relationships to practical matters of royal duty and public service. Kate had built strong relationships with various charitable organizations and international partners based on her current role and position within the royal hierarchy. Changes to that position could affect these important partnerships and potentially undermine years of careful relationship building. Kate found herself thinking about her children and how these changes might affect their futures. George, Charlotte, and Louis would inherit positions within the royal family that might be very different from what she and William had experienced. The precedents being established now could influence royal family dynamics for decades to come. When she reached her private office, Kate closed the door and allowed herself a moment of unguarded reflection. The professionalism she maintained in public required constant effort, and private moments like these provided necessary opportunities to process complex emotions and develop strategies for moving forward constructively. Her phone buzzed with a text message from William, who was attending a separate royal engagement in Scotland. "How did the meeting go?" he had written, his concern evident even in the brief message. The Prince of Wales had become increasingly worried about family dynamics and their potential impact on the monarchy's effectiveness. Kate considered her response carefully. Royal communications were never truly private, and she knew that anything she wrote could potentially be scrutinized by palace staff or security personnel. However, William deserved to know about significant developments that could affect their family's position and future. "Interesting developments and protocol discussions," she wrote back. "We'll fill you in properly when you return." The message was deliberately vague, but conveyed enough information to let William know that important changes were being discussed without providing details that could be misinterpreted if seen by others. Back in Clarence House, Charles and Camilla's conversation had moved on to practical matters of implementation. The Queen Consort had prepared detailed proposals for various ceremonial adjustments, seating arrangements, and protocol modifications that would reflect her vision of proper royal hierarchy. Her thoroughness was impressive, suggesting that she had been planning these changes for some time. "The key is consistency across all events," Camilla explained, referring to her notes with the precision of someone who had studied royal protocol extensively. "If we implement these changes gradually but systematically, they'll become accepted as normal practice without generating excessive commentary or speculation." Charles listened to her presentation with growing admiration for her strategic thinking and attention to detail. Camilla had clearly invested significant time and effort in developing these proposals, and her arguments were logically sound from an institutional perspective. However, he remained concerned about the human cost of changes that prioritized organizational efficiency over family relationships. "I appreciate the thoroughness of your planning," Charles said diplomatically, "but I hope we can implement these changes in ways that preserve important family partnerships. The Wales family's contributions to royal life have been substantial, and I want to ensure that remains true going forward." Camilla nodded with apparent understanding, though her expression suggested that she viewed Charles's concerns as manageable complications rather than fundamental obstacles. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Catherine and William will continue to play important roles within the framework we're establishing. These changes simply clarify reporting relationships and decision-making authority." The conversation continued for another half hour, with various details being discussed and refined. Throughout their discussion, Charles found himself thinking about the gesture that had been interrupted earlier and what it represented about the direction his family relationships were heading. The simple act of reaching out to Kate had seemed natural and appropriate, yet it had been reframed as a violation of proper protocol. As their meeting concluded, Charles felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease about the decisions they had reached. Camilla's arguments were compelling from an institutional standpoint, and her detailed planning suggested that the changes could be implemented smoothly with proper preparation. However, the emotional cost of these changes remained unclear, and Charles worried about long-term implications for family unity and effectiveness. "I think this represents a solid foundation for moving forward," Camilla said as she gathered her notes and prepared to leave for her next appointment. Her satisfaction was evident in both her tone and posture, suggesting that she felt the day's conversations had accomplished important objectives. "Yes," Charles agreed, though his response lacked the enthusiasm that Camilla seemed to feel. "I'll need some time to consider all the implications before we proceed with implementation." The request for additional consideration was diplomatic, but it also reflected his genuine uncertainty about the wisdom of some proposed changes. Camilla kissed his cheek before departing, a gesture of affection that also served to reinforce their partnership in the decisions that had been discussed. As the door closed behind her, Charles found himself alone with his thoughts and the weight of choices that would affect not just his immediate family but the institution he had inherited from his mother. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room as Charles contemplated the complex web of relationships, responsibilities, and competing demands that defined his role as king. The simple gesture of reaching out to Kate had been interrupted, but the implications of that interruption would continue to resonate through family dynamics and royal protocol for years to come. Outside, London continued its bustling pace, unaware of the private negotiations taking place within palace walls that would shape the public face of the monarchy for the foreseeable future. 3 weeks after the pivotal meeting in Clarence House, the effects of that morning's decisions had begun to ripple through royal life in ways both subtle and significant. The Commonwealth Day service had proceeded according to Camilla's revised protocol suggestions, with new seating arrangements and processional orders that reflected her vision of appropriate royal hierarchy. The changes had been implemented smoothly, largely unnoticed by the public, but clearly observed by those within palace circles. Kate stood in her dressing room at Kensington Palace, preparing for another significant royal engagement where the new dynamics would be tested once again. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who had maintained her composure and dignity despite the challenging adjustments of recent weeks. The Princess of Wales had adapted to the changing circumstances with characteristic grace, though those closest to her could detect subtle differences in her approach to royal duties. William entered the room, having returned from his latest series of engagements with a somber expression that had become increasingly common. The Prince of Wales had been briefed on the recent changes through careful conversations with Kate and his own observations of shifting family dynamics. His response had been measured but concerned, reflecting his awareness of broader implications for the monarchy's future. "How are you feeling about today's event?" William asked, adjusting his own formal attire while studying his wife's reflection. The question carried layers of meaning beyond simple logistical concerns, touching on the emotional and political complexities that now surrounded even routine royal appearances. Kate turned from the mirror to face her husband directly, her expression serious but determined. "I'm prepared," she said simply, though the weight behind those words conveyed much more. Preparation now meant not just understanding protocol and talking points, but navigating the new hierarchical structures that had been established and finding ways to serve effectively within those constraints. The event they were preparing for was a reception for international diplomats, exactly the kind of gathering where family dynamics and protocol arrangements would be closely observed by experienced diplomatic personnel. These events served as testing grounds for royal relationships, with subtle signals and interactions being analyzed and reported back to governments around the world. William moved closer to his wife, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this together," he said quietly, his voice carrying both affection and determination. The Prince of Wales had been thinking extensively about leadership and family dynamics, recognizing that his own future role as king would be shaped significantly by the precedents being established now. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their private secretary, who needed to review final details about the evening's arrangements. The discussion revealed that additional protocol modifications had been implemented since the Commonwealth Day service, further refining the hierarchical structures that Camilla had advocated for weeks earlier. The receiving line has been adjusted according to the new guidelines, the secretary explained diplomatically, referring to documents that had been circulated to senior royal staff outlining updated procedures for various ceremonial functions. These guidelines represented the practical implementation of Camilla's theoretical frameworks, translating abstract principles into concrete behavioral expectations. Kate nodded with professional acceptance, though William noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested ongoing concern about the direction of these changes. The Princess of Wales had built strong relationships with diplomatic personnel over years of careful engagement, and modifications to her role could affect these important international partnerships. As they prepared to depart for the evening's reception, Kate found herself thinking about the conversation with Charles that had initiated this sequence of changes. The interrupted gesture had become symbolic of broader shifts in family relationships, representing a moment when personal connections had been subordinated to institutional hierarchies and spousal loyalties. The reception itself proceeded smoothly from an operational standpoint, with the new protocol arrangements being implemented without obvious confusion or disruption. However, experienced diplomatic observers noticed subtle changes in royal family dynamics that would be reported in confidential cables to foreign ministries around the world. These reports would contribute to evolving international perceptions of British royal stability and effectiveness. During the event, Kate had several opportunities to interact with Charles in formal settings that tested the new dynamic between them. Their conversations were cordial and appropriate, maintaining the professional warmth that had always characterized their public relationship. However, the easy familial affection that had previously defined their interactions seemed more constrained, filtered through awareness of watching eyes and established hierarchies. Camilla presided over the evening with evident satisfaction, her role clearly established and prominently displayed throughout the various ceremonial components of the reception. The Queen Consort engaged with diplomatic personnel with confidence and authority, demonstrating the institutional benefits of clear hierarchical structures and defined responsibilities. Charles navigated the evening with his characteristic dedication to duty, though those who knew him well could detect underlying tension in his demeanor. The king was discovering that implementing organizational changes required ongoing emotional adjustments that were more challenging than the theoretical discussions that had preceded them. As the formal portions of the evening concluded, Charles found himself with a brief opportunity for private conversation with Kate during the transition between reception areas. The moment presented a chance to address some of the unresolved feelings from their earlier meeting and its aftermath. "Kate," Charles said quietly as they walked together toward the next reception area, "I hope you understand that recent changes reflect institutional necessities rather than personal preferences." The statement was carefully phrased to acknowledge the complexity of their situation without directly criticizing the decisions that had been made. Kate appreciated the gesture, even as she recognized its limitations. "Of course, Your Majesty," she replied formally, though her tone carried warmth that indicated ongoing affection despite changed circumstances. "The institution's needs must always come first, and William and I remain committed to serving effectively within whatever framework is established." The exchange was brief but meaningful, representing a kind of reconciliation that acknowledged new realities while preserving important underlying relationships. Both Charles and Kate understood that their personal connection had been affected by recent changes, but both remained committed to family unity and institutional effectiveness. As the evening progressed, William observed his father and wife's interaction with relief and continued concern. The Prince of Wales was pleased to see that family relationships could be maintained despite protocol modifications, but he remained worried about long-term implications for monarchy effectiveness and family harmony. The reception concluded successfully, with diplomatic guests departing with positive impressions of royal hospitality and organization. From a public relations standpoint, the event had achieved its objectives while demonstrating the practical implementation of new hierarchical structures without generating controversy or confusion. However, The private conversations that followed revealed ongoing complexity beneath the smooth public presentation. Family members returned to their respective residences with different perspectives on the evening's success and its implications for future royal operations. At Clarence House, Charles and Camilla reviewed the evening's events with satisfaction about the successful implementation of new protocols. The Queen Consort felt vindicated in her strategic approach to family dynamics, seeing evidence that clear hierarchies could enhance rather than undermine royal effectiveness. "I think that went very well," Camilla observed as they prepared for bed, her tone reflecting genuine pleasure at the evening's smooth execution. The new arrangements provided clear guidance for staff and guests while maintaining appropriate dignity and ceremony. Charles agreed that the evening had proceeded smoothly, though he remained thoughtful about the broader implications of the changes they had implemented. "Yes, the operational aspects were handled very well," he said. "I hope we can continue to find ways to balance institutional requirements with family relationships going forward." Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, William and Kate conducted their own review of the evening's events and their implications for future royal service. Both had performed their duties effectively within the new framework, but both also recognized that adjustments would continue to be necessary as they adapted to evolving circumstances. "I think we're finding our footing," Kate said as they discussed the evening's various interactions and their significance. "The key is maintaining our effectiveness in service while working constructively within the established structure." William nodded, though he continued to monitor family dynamics carefully for signs of tension that could affect the monarchy's long-term stability. The Prince of Wales understood that his own future reign would be influenced significantly by the precedents and relationships being established during his father's early years as king. Over the following months, the new protocols and hierarchical structures became increasingly normalized within royal operations. Staff adapted to modified procedures, diplomatic personnel adjusted their expectations and interactions accordingly, and family members developed new patterns of relationship that balanced personal affection with institutional requirements. The interrupted gesture that had catalyzed these changes became a distant memory, though its symbolic significance continued to influence how family members approached their relationships with each other. Charles had learned important lessons about balancing competing loyalties and demands, while Kate had demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to changed circumstances without compromising her effectiveness or dignity. Camilla's vision of clear hierarchical structures had been successfully implemented, providing the institutional framework she had advocated while preserving essential family relationships and public service capabilities. The changes had been achieved without major controversy or disruption, validating her strategic approach to family dynamics and protocol modification. As the royal family settled into these new patterns, the interrupted gesture remained a private moment that had shaped public institutions and personal relationships in ways that would continue to resonate for years to come. The balance between family feeling and institutional requirements had been recalibrated, creating a new equilibrium that served both personal and organizational needs while preparing the monarchy for its continued evolution in the 21st century. The quiet plea that had been denied had ultimately led to a clearer understanding of roles, relationships, and responsibilities within the royal family. Though the moment of connection had been interrupted, the deeper bonds of family and shared service had proven resilient enough to adapt to new realities while preserving the essential qualities that made the monarchy effective and relevant to contemporary British society.